as I say, we'll start today with making a bit of progress into what's going on in the 17th century, and then if we have some time at the end, I'll go back to a review of life around about this time, at the beginning of the 17th century. So, the accession, remember that word accession? Becoming king or becoming queen. I'd like to look at how that happens. You remember when it was Queen Elizabeth, she was very popular. It was an easy beginning for her. And she went on to be a very popular queen for much of her life. But by the end, people were getting tired of her and she was getting tired of everything. So the ending part wasn't quite so good. So remember what I said about Henry VII's daughter marrying the King of Scotland. And of course, the English kings and queens carried on through the Tudor family, but with the death of Elizabeth, there was nobody else left. She had no children, and there was nobody else in this line. So it passed over to James. This was decided before Elizabeth died, that it would go to James. And notice who James's mother was, Mary, Queen of Scots. So Henry's sister, Henry the Eighth's sister, Margaret, had married James Stuart, and Elizabeth died with no direct heir, and so the great-grandson, James, became the King of England. Another of those cases, or one of those cases that we got quite often in this period, where the English are saying to the King of Scotland, look, I know we cut your mum's head off. We're sorry about that. But would you mind, would you be our king, please? And he says, you're bits and neat. Okay, yeah, I will. Might sound a bit cold. I know you chopped my mum's head off, but I don't mind. I'll be your king. But the honest fact of the matter is that he didn't really know his mother. All right, he was separated from her at a very early age. He never really knew his mother. So I guess she didn't have that much importance, practical importance for him. And in the meantime, of course, Scotland had also become a Protestant country. So James was not a Catholic as such. And he was the King of England. He was the leader of the Church of England, which was a Protestant church. So anyway, we've got England and Wales already united from quite a long time before, and that relationship made stronger through the Tudor family. The Tudor family were a Welsh family. And the King of England, or the ruler of England, also claimed control of Ireland. So Scotland was the only part of the British Isles that was kind of outside a relationship with England. England had made its relationship with Wales, and that was pretty strong, and it had been going for several hundred years. It had been pushing its way into Ireland. It wasn't welcome, right? The Irish weren't happy. But it had pushed its way into Ireland, and so by force, really, Ireland was being controlled, much of Ireland was being controlled by the English, so it was only Scotland. But from now on, Scotland and England are very close. They don't make a proper connection. They don't formally sign a piece of paper to say we are one country until 100 years later. More than 100 years later. But basically, it's all together now, the same king. So there's a fairly strong connection. It doesn't mean that they're always peaceful. We'll see later on there's some fighting of Scotland against England. But the two countries are now much closer. So it didn't formally unite until 1707, and Ireland didn't formally unite until 1801. But once James became the king, the four countries of the British Isles were very closely linked. There was a close connection between them. It's not a complete united kingdom, but the countries are much closer than they were. Are we okay? People filling in the gaps there. All right then, good. So yes, I started off talking a little bit about religion. Let's come back to that in more detail. One of the main features of James's reign was his attitude towards religion. And I mentioned this a little bit before. Does anybody remember? It's a question about politics and religion, and especially his position as the king. Kind of mentioned it, but you probably don't remember. He believed God had chosen him to be king. Okay, I think I mentioned this a little bit last week. So it's called divine right, believing in the divine. Divine means from God. Okay, it's another word that comes from Latin. Divine right, chosen by God. So he took his position as the head of the Church of England very seriously. He'd been chosen by God to do this. And it's at this time that we get the most famous translation of the Bible into English, still used when I was a little boy, still used by some people. If you study English literature and you look at the, in your quotations from the Bible by other writers, hotondo, King James Bible, they're mostly using the King James Bible. It's the famous version of the Bible. So if you look at a modern translation of the Bible, it says, for example, the law brought by Moses is you shall not kill, or you must not kill, or you should not kill, or something like that. King James Bible, thou shalt not. Okay, thou shalt not kill. It's an older version of English. It's the same English that William Shakespeare was using. It's the English of this period, the doshi wa chotto chigaimashita, okay, and you, they said thou. Okay, you was kind of anata, kimi, okay. The sonke word was thou, all right, so thou shalt not kill. So this translation of the Bible was set in motion by James. And although he was a Protestant, his mother was Catholic, obviously. He had some kind of Catholic idea. Some of his ideas were quite close to Catholicism. And the Catholics were hoping that they would get a better deal, that they'd get better treatment under James. This did not happen. The Catholics were disappointed, and there was a very famous attempt to kill James and to kill the whole of the members of the Houses of Parliament. This is called the Gunpowder Plot that happened in 1605. We'll come back to that and look at that in a little bit more detail later on. And the same thing is true of the Puritans. You'll remember that Elizabeth was trying to make a kind of via media church, so that the Church of England, sometimes called the C of E, the Church of England was kind of trying to get as many people into it as possible. But there were some people on either side, Catholics on this side, Puritans on this side, who just wouldn't fit into, however wide she made it, okay? However open she made her church, Some Puritans said, no, we can't accept it, and some Catholics said, no, we can't accept it. Now, these people were hoping that James would, open things up a little bit, okay? Or maybe even move the church further over in that direction or in this direction, okay? They were hoping for some changes. Basically, he didn't really make any changes. He kept the church very much as it was under Elizabeth and said, no, you're outside my church. You Catholics, you Puritans, you're too extreme, and I can't fit you into my church. So they were disappointed on both sides, and especially the Catholics showed their disappointment through the Gunpowder Plot. The Puritans went on being disappointed more and more and more, and in the middle of the century, we have a revolution, Kakumi. Okay, so we'll be looking at the Puritan Revolution later on. Okay. James. Now, he considered himself a scholar, an academic, an educated man, and he published several books. Okay, these are the publications of King James. You can see that he did not like tobacco, and he wrote a book against it. He wrote about the monarchy, the position of the king or queen. He wrote about the oath of allegiance, which is where you say, if you are in my country, you have to promise that you follow me and you accept my religion, that kind of thing. He wrote books about these kinds of political topics and social topics like this. And yes, tobacco, I think we said, the tobacco was introduced in Shakespeare's time, and James was very much against tobacco. He hated it, and he wrote a book about it. But one of these books is quite important in the context of English history at the time. So I'd like to look at it a little bit more closely. It's this one. In form of a dialogue, demonology. A demon is akuma, okay? Okay. The ology bit means studying or knowing about, the knowledge of something. So he's teaching about the devil. And we've already had this question on the blog a little bit about witches. This is one of the influences, important influences on people's belief in witches at that time. Because basically that's what he's writing about. He's writing about witches. Major. So James and witchcraft. That's the connection that we're looking at here. It's a book about witches. And like a lot of people in those days, James really believed in witches. That they could make harmful spells, that they could damage people with their ijiwaru. Now, if we go back to the beginnings of Christianity, maybe it's worth making a little bit of an explanation here, because, here in Japan, you have, Shinto, and you have the Shinto shrine, and then you have Buddhism, and you have the Buddhist temple, and they're next to each other, okay? People go across the road to this one, and they do a little bit of, praying, or, and they go back to this one, and they get an omamori, and there's no kind of problem. Sometimes you find Shinto things in Buddhist temples, and sometimes you find Buddhist things in Shinto temples, and there's no particular problem with that. Christianity was completely different. Here's the old religion in every country, all right, in Britain, in Germany, in Italy, wherever you go. The old religion does not exist together with Christianity, because when Christianity came, it said, we put ourselves where you were, okay? Christianity said, okay, for example, you have mostly the old religions had festivals in the summer, in the winter, in the spring, in the autumn, with the 4 seasons. You already have a winter festival. Now, your winter festival is Jesus Christ's birthday. Okay? But it's your old festival, but we just put Jesus Christ's birthday on top of it. And if you study the Christmas traditions, they use, for example, hiragi, holly, they use ivy, they use mistletoe. You can check the names of these in the dictionary if you like. These plants that are connected with Christmas, they were all used in the winter festival by the old religion. And they just became part of the modern Christmas. So Christianity's way of working was to put itself on top of the old religion and push it down. At first, it was not so negative. There was some kind of respect between the two. All right, there wasn't a, like, say, no, well, we're welcome, and your Shimpu-sama, he can be our Shimpu-sama, we don't have to fight about this, we just put our religion on top of yours, as it were. As time went by, the old religion became more and more taboo. So the people who were using many of these old customs, they became like pushed down and taboo. So the word witch, basically the origin of the word is wise one. In the old belief, the wise one, the Shimpu-sama, the wise person, the person who understands the way of using herbs and plants to heal you, the person who understands those kinds of things. But this became more and more taboo. Some people try to find a connection. They try to say, Hontoni mada 17 seiki demo そういうwise one が存在しました。ハーブの使い方とか。そしてこの人は魔女になりました。The actual people who were the old wise ones became the witches. 多分そうではない。Basically, by the 17th century, most of this had simply disappeared. It had just gone. Okay? There might have been some people who said, oh, this herb is very good for sickness, but there were very, very little of the old witch, the old wise one ideas survived. So it's not really that people said, oh, this is, this person is following the old religion's ways or something. It was just random. Daredemo. Okay? You're a witch, you're a witch, you're a witch. Anyone. Okay? There wasn't a real focus on people who were practicing the old religion. So the old religion had more or less died out by the 17th century. But it was kept alive, or belief that in witches was kept alive by books like this. In Scotland, it was worse. At least probably around 5,000 people were put to death in Scotland during these centuries. In England, it was a smaller number, about 1,000, but still quite serious. Mostly women, not always women, but mostly women. And this has a big connection with our famous William Shakespeare as well. The three witches. Do you know a story of three witches? Shakespeare's Macbeth. Yeah, you were going to say that. Yeah, all right. The three witches in Macbeth. Macbeth was a real person. Very often people don't realise that the stories that Shakespeare tells, some of them are history, or he's changed the history, but it's based on history. Some of them are, mostly he uses older stories. And Macbeth was a real person, and you can read about his history in several accounts, but Shakespeare used Holinshed's Chronicles in many of his plays. He went back to Holinshed to get information about the lives of the people that he's writing his plays about. But there are no witches in Holingshed's Chronicles. So why did Shakespeare put the witches into Macbeth? It's because he wrote the play at the time that James became king. And he wanted to please James. So he thought, James likes witches, or he likes stories about witches. He believes in witches. I'll put some witches into my play, and James will be happy. So he put the witches in to please the new king. Okay, the witches in Macbeth, they're not in the historical story. They're not in any of the versions of the story. Shakespeare put in the witches to keep James happy. All right? As I said, it was sometimes men, but mostly it was women who were accused of being witches. And partly this goes back to the Bible. Because in the Bible, of course, it's Eve who is the weak one. It's the woman who is weak, the woman who accepts the apple. The first woman is tempted by a snake. She eats the forbidden fruit and she gives it to Adam. And in these days, people believed very strongly that women were much more easily evil, much more easily ijiwaru than men. Women could follow the devil much more easily than men. So part of the belief in witches comes from the Bible, where it's the woman who is weak for ijiwaru, for evil. So this is it's part of the reason why the early modern period very often punished women and accused women, because there was a strong belief that women were evil, or more likely to be evil. They were more easily attracted to evil than men were. Which really brings us on to the question of James I and women. More and more, when they look at the witch hunts these days, people analysing the witch hunts from the psychological point of view see it as a form of hatred of women, a form of misogyny, which is a Greek word, Gidishano, means hating women. We don't know whether James in some way hated women. He married at the age of 24, he had 3 children, but most historians consider that he was basically homosexual. He was at least bisexual. Obviously, he had children, but his sense of sexual attraction probably went towards men rather than towards women. This is his wife, and as I say, he had 3 children by her. Okay. People still writing down things. I'll give you a little moment. Okay. That's his wife, Anne of Denmark. And they were still using Latin in those days, quite a lot, and they made a little kind of, is it not, what do you call it? An epigram is not quite the same as a proverb. It's not really a kotowaza. I'm not sure what the Japanese word is, but it's like a kind of saying, Rex fuit Elizabeth. Elizabeth was our king. She was a dansei tekina jose. She was a masculine kind of woman. Nunc est regina Jacobus. Now, James is our queen, because he was a jose tekina dansei. He was an effeminated man. Yeah, Jacobus is just the Latin word for James. And again, that may or may not be connected with the emphasis on women in witchcraft. Okay? Some historians would say it is. Let's move on to international relationships and politics in that bigger sphere. One thing James did was he succeeded in keeping England mostly out of the big battles, the big power struggles that were going on in Europe. Remember, during the last years of Elizabeth's reign, there was war with Spain. He ended the war with Spain, and one way he did this was, again, just as Elizabeth had managed to keep peace with other countries by the kind of hint that maybe I'll marry you, you don't have to fight me, maybe I'll marry you. And Spain, especially King Philip of Spain, had hopes that maybe Elizabeth would marry him, just as he had been married to Mary. Maybe he would be married to Elizabeth, and it would give him control of England. In the same way, there was a hope that James's son Charles would marry the daughter of the King of Spain. It was called the Spanish match. Okay? And it went on for a long time. The English Parliament didn't want this marriage. Again, remember, the English weren't happy with these high-level princes and people marrying Catholics. And so Charles, as he grew older, he thought, oh, come on, all this politics, all this delay. I'll go to Spain and I'll meet her and I'll propose to her romantically in person. So he did. He went to Spain to win her heart. Okay, on his white horse, and she hated him. As soon as she saw him, oh my God, I don't want anything to do with it. So the Spanish match was over. She clearly said she would never marry Charles. Now, the other big, terrible war that was going on in Europe at this time is called the 30 Years' War. It was very, very nasty. And most of the time, England was outside this war. So that's good for England, because it was a very, very nasty, very violent, very vicious war. So this is where James was successful. He wasn't successful with his son in Spain, but he was more successful with his daughter in Germany. Now, at this time, Germany was not a united country. The same would be true of other countries of Europe at this time, like Italy. They were not united countries. Germany was divided into many smaller countries. And some of these countries had different names. One of the types of country was a palatinate. Okay, It's a little bit different from a kingdom. Okay, the position of the ruling person is technically a little bit different. It's not, the difference is not important to us now, but she married the Elector Palatine of an area of what is now Germany. So he's lower than a prince or a king, but he also became king of Bohemia later on, and so Elizabeth was the queen. But then, unfortunately, Frederick got into a fight with the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, I haven't spoken much about European history at this time. The Roman Empire ended in the 5th century. So Sengnem Ijo Mai, more than 1,000 years before. But it did continue in two forms. So when we think of basically the Roman Empire, we're normally thinking of the Western Roman Empire. But it continued in the East. You have an Eastern Roman Empire. Focused not on the capital of Rome, but Constantinople as its capital. This is important for Europe because during the 15th, early 16th century, Turkey is becoming, the Ottoman Turks are becoming stronger, and they push the people out of Constantinople. Well, some of them stay, but many of them run away and come to the West. And this is the beginning of the Renaissance. Or it's an important influence beginning the Renaissance because there were many scholars, there was a lot of scholarship, there were big libraries, there was much more education, history, culture in Constantinople than there was in the Western Europe at that time. So when the Turkish attacked and took control and people ran away from Constantinople into Europe, they were bringing books, they were bringing scholarship, they were bringing philosophy, they were bringing knowledge. And that was one of the things that led to the Renaissance. The other thing that continued was the Holy Roman Empire, which was based on the church. The political power of the Catholic Church over the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire. So this 30 Years' War is connected with this, with the Holy Roman Empire, which had been continuing after the fall of the political Roman Empire. And so it had its own emperor, Ferdinand II, but there was a constant power struggle going on in Europe between the Holy Roman Empire and the countries inside Europe that the Holy Roman Emperor was kind of trying to control. Basically, what happened here was that Elizabeth's husband, Frederick, got into a fight with the Holy Roman Emperor, and he lost his position. And James said, I don't want to come and help you. This is how James avoided the 30 Years' War. By saying, I'm not going to help you. I know you're my daughter's husband, but I don't care. Okay, basically it's your problem, it's not my problem. Yes, this led to this very, very nasty war, the 30 Years' War, and by refusing to support Frederick, James kept England out of this very nasty European war. For most of the war, England was not involved. Okay? Okay. And again, this is going to be important because the descendants of Elizabeth and Frederick would take over when the Stuarts died out. Just as the Tudors died out and the Scottish Stuarts took control, became king, James became king from the Stuart family. In the same way, when the Stuarts come to an end, it'll be this family from basically what is now Germany that will become the ruling family. And that family basically still continues today. So there's a curious position, for example, in World War II. England is fighting Germany, but the English Queen is of German origin. Okay, sort of complicated feelings about that. Okay, yes, this I put a graphic image of the violence and nastiness. You can sort of see how it was all, they're shown with skeletons because it was such a violence. There were so many people died in horrible ways in this very nasty war. Okay, let's move over to the New World. Does anybody remember when the New World was discovered? It's one of those big years in history. If you're going to pick out some big years, like for England, 1066, 1492. Okay? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's how I remembered it when I was a schoolboy. 1492, the New World, America, was discovered. So by the time that James comes along, it's more than 100 years later, and colonization is getting started. It started, of course, with the Spanish and the Portuguese, who today, the results of their occupation are mostly seen in South and Central America. Okay, Brazil is Portuguese speaking. Most of South America, well, otherwise South America is basically Spanish speaking, and Central America basically Spanish speaking, because they got there first. But the English soon came along and started their colonization as well. The first successful colony, remember last week I mentioned a colony, but it failed in Elizabeth's time. It didn't succeed. This is the first successful colony. It was called Jamestown, following the king, King James. And in 1609, it was founded in what is now Virginia. It was attacked by Native Americans, and all except 60 of the settlers died. So 80% of them died. Is that right? Something like that, anyway. Out of 300, only 60 survived the winter. After that, it did well, and its economy was based on tobacco, which James hated, but anyway, it made money for them. And tobacco was really spreading. Even though James wrote a book against it, tobacco was becoming very popular, and by 1614 there were 7,000 tobacco houses, places where people specially went to smoke tobacco in London. And then in 1619 the slave trade begins. The first slaves from Africa were taken to cultivate tobacco. This is basically because most of the Native American people, either they died fighting, okay, they just didn't surrender, they just died fighting, or they died of disease. Millions of them died of disease because they had never experienced even a simple thing like a cold or influenza. Those things would kill those people because they'd never had those illnesses in their community. So the viruses affected them very, very strongly. Or else they just mostly were not suitable as slaves, in the sense that they would not obey. They just wouldn't do what they were told. They just wouldn't. Okay? They just simply, you can't enslave those people. They would die. They would experience hunger. They would do anything. They just wouldn't do what they were told. So to fill the labour gap, England started exporting slaves from Africa. Africa had a long history of slavery, and the culture was adapted to the whole process rather more than the Native Americans were. And so we begin something called the slave triangle. Okay, this triangular trade, which we'll come back to in a little minute. We'll talk about that a bit more. And it was going to dominate the British Empire eventually in the West. The Eastern Empire grows up in a different way. And most of you know the name Pocahontas through Disney. She was a real woman, and she really did marry the leader of the Jamestown colony. And she really did go to London. All of that is true. So you might be interested in the history of Pocahontas. This is what the colony was looking like by the late 17th century. But it was not a suitable place. And although it was, as I say, it was the first successful colony in that it lasted for several generations, but in the end they just moved it. People left. The ground was not suitable. It was too damp, too wet there. So it was moved. People went to other places. And then by this time, there were other English colonies that were going strong. So this kind of looks like a little village, really. These kinds of European villages were growing up in America during the 17th century. Very famous, especially at this time of year when America is having its Thanksgiving festival, where they're sort of remembering all of its history, the Pilgrim Fathers. Now, I talked about those Puritan groups that could not be accepted inside the church. One of those groups were called Brownists, because they followed a man called Robert Brown. And he was what's called a Congregationalist. Now, the congregation just means the people who go to the church, the congregation. So he wanted each church to be controlled by the people who go to it. We go to the church, so we should control that church. That's a simple idea, isn't it? Why do we have to have a hierarchy of church structure with bishops and archbishops and the king at the top? Okay, this is basically what he's challenging. All right, the church structure where the congregation is at the bottom. The king or queen is at the top. The bishops, the archbishops, the bishops, the regular priests, and so on are kind of at the top, higher levels of the hierarchy, and at the bottom is just the ordinary people. What the Brownists congregate church, the people in that church, to make their own decisions with no structure like that. Well, because of that close relationship between religion and politics and power, this was considered a very dangerous idea. These people can decide anything they want. They can make their own church. They can make their own rules for their own church. And the king has no power, no structure. There's no way of controlling these people. Oh, no. We can't let that happen. And so the Brownists were not accepted as part of the social structure of that time. Actually, Brown himself changed his position and did become a member of the Church of England, but the name Brownist, the name stuck. Followers of Robert Brown, although Brown himself changed his mind. Well, the time came when the Brownists decided it's just too tough here. Conditions are too difficult. All across Europe, similar people with similar ideas, often known as Anabaptists. Okay, Anabaptists. Thousands and thousands of these people who were challenging the church's structure across Europe, thousands and thousands of them were being put to death. More than Christians were ever fed to lions by the Romans. Okay? So it was not a healthy environment for people. So looking at the situation in Europe and thinking about what might happen to them in England, these people decided to leave. So a group of Puritans, many of them were most of them were Brownists, not all of them. They set sail for America in a ship called the Mayflower. In order to be able to have the freedom to make their own churches. England did not give them that freedom, so they believed that if they left England, they'd be able to set up their own churches in America, and that's what they went off to do. And they're called the Pilgrim Fathers, and they're considered people. If an American can say, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of the Pilgrim Fathers, it's like, oh, you are a real American or something. You know, it's sort of like, this is where the country kind of takes its national identity from to a certain extent. All right? Or it's part of that. So that has, in some ways, more of a symbolic importance than an actual importance, because of course there were many other people who went to America afterwards, but it was an important event. They had a lot of difficulty escaping from getting out of England. They were almost kept behind and weren't able to get out, but they finally left for America in 1620. All right, now to the politics inside the country, James and his parliament. The economy was a big problem. The country already owed he inherited a debt from Queen Elizabeth, but very quickly that debt grew bigger. Basically, Scotland was a much more basic kind of place. The food was simpler, the lifestyle was simpler. Scotland is a cold country. England is further south, it's more comfortable. London has a much more comfortable life than people in Scotland mostly were able to have at that time. And James loved it. So he was out there spending money, and I'm the king, and I can buy what I want, and I can eat what I want, and I can live a luxurious life. And isn't this wonderful? In Scotland, even kings don't do this. So he got used to a kind of rich lifestyle, and the debt increased and increased. And some of it was because of his own lifestyle, some of it was because he wanted to, there were various things that he wanted to do that took money. And this is the origin of most of his kenka, most of his arguments, his quarrels with Parliament. Money. Religion was also part of the fight, and the constitution, the structure, the power structure of the country was another important point. And when he could not agree with Parliament, he simply said, well, go home. Closed the Parliament, said, we're finished. I don't need to talk to you, I don't want to talk to you, I'm just not interested in making any kind of compromise or coming to any kind of agreement through Parliament. And so for long periods of time, there was no active Parliament at all. And the economy got worse and worse. He wanted to raise taxes, government said no, so there would be no agreement, and the country was getting into more and more economic difficulty. And then, towards the end of his reign, there was another outbreak of pestle. About 100,000 people died of plague at the end of his reign. So things were not so good. Again, at the end of his reign, things were going downhill. And then when James dies and his son takes power, these problems are going to get much worse, and this is going to lead, in the end, to civil war. And the king will lose his head.